All right, everybody. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So today's lecture, so originally we were supposed to be doing today as Balaji's lecture on DAOs and decentralized applications. Fortunately, Balaji had to reschedule, and so we're going to shift his lecture forward, and instead we're going to pull up this lecture, which is about how to find a good idea. So before I jump into things, I want to caveat, I'm in Singapore right now, so it is 7 a.m. here. I'm very jet lagged, so I'm moving a bit slow. I got not a ton of sleep last night, so if I'm being slow, or if I'm saying anything in a way that is confusing, feel free to ask a question in the chat. Xiaoyuan or Megan, it'd be great if you guys could jump in and relay some of the questions from the chat, since I'm going to be going through slides in this presentation. So if there are any questions, just unmute, pipe in, and ask me, and I can stop and make sure that I clarify. This is also, in particular, this lecture is a pretty open-ended lecture. We're talking about a pretty abstract concept, which is how to pick a good idea, how to find a good idea. So if you have, so please ask questions. And I may not be able to give you particular feedback on your idea. That's not exactly what this lecture is about. It's not like a Shark Tank type lecture, but if there are specific questions around some of these concepts that I go over in the lecture that you'd like me to answer, I'm more than happy to do that. So, and sorry, when I say chat, I mean to ask the question through the question ASCII thing in the Q&A section. Okay, so TAs, please assist, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me see.
Yeah, sure thing. We'll be that.
Oh, that was fun. Okay, let's see here. And where is, here we go. Okay, can you confirm that this is visible? Xiaoyuan? Give me the word. Still good?
Oh, I think we are looking at like the presenter's view.
Oh, you're looking at the presenter view. Okay, let me switch that. Here we go. Okay. Is this good? Are you seeing the right view now?
Oh, good. Thanks.
Perfect. Okay, great. All righty. So let us go ahead and kick things off. Hold on one second. Let me just move this away. Okay, cool. All right. So today we're going to be talking about how to find a good idea. So the kernel of every startup is the idea. There's an old saying in Silicon Valley. People talk about how ideas are. So classically, a lot of startup founders come in thinking that ideas are everything. Ideas are the most important thing. And if you have a good idea, you should safeguard it with your life. You should never tell anyone. Anybody you want to talk to, then you sign an NDA, then you do all this stuff. Silicon Valley, broadly speaking, does not work that way. In Silicon Valley, generally speaking, when you have an idea, the old mantra is that ideas are worthless and execution is everything. What that means is that there are a lot of people who have ideas, a lot of people who have good ideas even. And so good ideas should not be safeguarded. They're not like a secret jewel that you shouldn't tell anyone about. You should actually tell lots of people about your idea, because the best way to iterate on your idea and figure out which ideas are good and which ideas are bad is just having lots of them and talking to people about them and getting feedback. But it's still nevertheless true that the kernel of every startup is the idea. Without a good idea, you will not be able to have a good startup. That doesn't mean you have to start with a good idea. Your initial idea can be mediocre, or it can be something that just kind of iterates you in the direction of the idea that you'll eventually build. But the idea is obviously a really important starting place, because it determines what market you'll be building in and the kind of problem that you'll try and be solved. So how does one actually find a good idea? So I'm going to take a very, very kind of high level zoomed out view of how I think about the different paths to ideation, right? You probably know at this point that there are a lot of different problems in crypto. There are a lot of different kinds of startups in crypto. There are protocols, there are applications, there are companies like custodians, there's brokerages, there's exchanges. How do you know which of these things is a good idea to build? Generally speaking, there are two ways to try to find an idea. One way is what I'd call top-down ideation, and the other way is bottoms-up ideation. So we'll start with top-down. So what is top-down ideation? Top-down ideation is basically, it's almost like imagine yourself behind a veil of ignorance. You don't know anything about yourself or who you are. You're just thinking about the industry. You're looking at the industry from a 1,000-foot view and trying to figure out where are the most attractive places to build things or to solve problems? So you might start by thinking, what are the biggest problems in the industry? And you might break this down by vertical, right? So there are these different problems that apply very differently to different parts of the, sort of crypto or Web3 stack. So for example, something like blockchain privacy, it's a big problem. Ethereum doesn't really have privacy. Bitcoin doesn't really have privacy. How can you create privacy? That's a huge problem in the industry. That seems like maybe a problem you could say is one of the largest in the industry. Something like transaction monitoring, something like tax compliance. These are all big problems that different people in the industry face. And top-down ideation would basically say, okay, I'm going to take one of these big, kind of very broadly defined problems and figure out how to analyze it, how to solve it, and whether I can build a startup around it. So one of the questions you might want to ask when you're thinking about how to find an idea in this kind of top-down ideation kind of way is you'd want to ask yourself, what is the total addressable market for this problem? This is often called the TAM, or often abbreviated as the TAM. The total addressable market basically means more or less, what is the total amount of revenue that I would be able to generate by solving this problem en masse? So oftentimes this is, if it's a well-developed market, it's generally straightforward to ask, what is the total addressable market? So for example, let's say you want to start a staking business and you say, okay, I'm going to run a custodial staking business. If you want to stake your Ether or other assets that you want to get staking revenue from, I'm going to run a business that does that in a custodial way. So it takes deposits from customers and I keep 10% of the staking profits, okay? The way you calculate the total addressable market is you say, okay, what's the total amount of Ether that's going to get staked or other crypto assets that are going to get staked? I multiply that giant number by the overall, the income rate made by, or the APY that's made by stakers, and then I multiply that by 10%. That would be the total addressable market for this kind of staking as a service type business. Now, calculating the TAM for things that are not that straightforward is much more difficult. So it's not always necessary that you calculate a TAM, but it's something very often you want to do, just kind of a back of the napkin thing, to have a broad idea of, okay, in the absolute crazy success scenario, what is a likely outcome if I totally solve this problem and are able to capture a lot of value? Again, very often this can be a somewhat academic or abstract exercise, like what's the total addressable market for Bitcoin? I don't know. Is it like gold? Maybe. Okay. What's the total addressable market for Ethereum? I don't know. It's kind of a new thing. Nobody really knows what the total addressable market for Ethereum is. And so for that reason, it can sometimes be a somewhat empty exercise to try to calculate a total addressable market, but it can give you at least a rule of thumb to understand, okay, is this market just way too small, right? So for example, if you're trying to build something like, okay, I'm going to do, tax compliance for the EU for DeFi. Okay, we'll multiply those things out, right? Like how much volume is there in DeFi? How many people from there are probably from the EU? What's the tax burden for those people? How much are you going to be able to charge for tax compliance? All these things, you kind of multiply them out together, and you might get an idea of, okay, this is not a huge addressable market. And so it might be difficult with an addressable market that's too small for you to actually build a sufficiently large and scalable startup. The other thing you want to ask yourself when you're looking at in a top-down way in the industry is, how crowded is this area? If there are a lot of other startups or a lot of other founders who are targeting this particular problem, then even if the total addressable market is large, it might be very competitive. So all other things equal, let's imagine that you're looking at two verticals. One has a total addressable market of 10 billion. The other is a total addressable market of 5 billion. But the one that has 10 billion has way more competitors in it than the one who has a total addressable market of 5 billion. Well, then all other things equal, you would rather actually work in the $5 billion market because it's not as crowded. And so if you imagine each person who's tackling this market is carving out a piece of that total addressable market, then in expectation, you'll actually be, in a sense, your expected value will be higher if you're attacking a market that has a higher total addressable market a lower total addressable market, but fewer competition. And then lastly, when you're looking at an area in a top-down way, you want to ask yourself the question of, are there recent innovations or breakthroughs that allow technological underlying improvements or change the market structure? Is there something that's now possible that wasn't possible before if I look at this kind of top-down area? So for example, in privacy, one technological change that may have happened recently is that we didn't really have scalable constructions for zero-knowledge proofs except in the last couple of years. And so, okay, that is something that really changes the market structure. It allows a new kind of application that previously wasn't possible to suddenly become possible. And so when you're looking in this top-down way, very often the thing that might be the impetus to build something new is that something in the underlying landscape has changed. And that makes it possible for you to tackle something in a new way. So that's top-down ideation. Any questions on that in particular, Xiaoyuan?
Yeah, so we have
Looks like you're echoing. So I just lost you.
yeah, sorry, just changing the device. So we have like a question in the channel asking, is a small market a bad thing? How would you have calculated the market for Airbnb or Coinbase in the initial idea stage?
It's a great question. So for something like Airbnb or Coinbase, the total addressable market, very often total addressable market is kind of a bullshit exercise, because again, for things that are betting on behavior change, especially large, sort of en masse behavior change, like an Airbnb, doing a total addressable market calculation is kind of like, it's just not super meaningful, because nobody really knows, how many people would ever decide to, stay in someone else's house, right? That at that time when Airbnb was first starting, that was such an atypical kind of behavior. Most people were very paranoid about staying in other people's houses. If you look at a lot of the companies that were most successful in kind of the Web2 era, right? So, the things that your parents told you not to do. So your parents told you not to talk to strangers. Well, okay, well, that's what Twitter is, right? Twitter is just talking to strangers. Your parents told you, not to stay at a stranger's house. Okay, well, that's what Airbnb is. It's staying at a stranger's house, right? Told you not to ride in a stranger's car. Okay, well, that's what Uber is. Uber is riding in a stranger's car. All these things that we were taught not to do, and those have become they were very strange behaviors. It turned out that they massively increase in becoming normalized. And so if you'd done a total addressable market calculation for something like, okay, what's a subset of people who are weird enough that they're gonna be willing to stay on someone else's couch, you would have ended up with a very small number. And that number was totally wrong, because the number of people who actually were willing to engage in this behavior became much higher over time because of the work of that startup that normalized this totally new behavior. Same thing with Coinbase. When Coinbase first started, very, very few people had crypto wallets. So if you looked at the market cap of crypto at that time, market cap of crypto was tiny. They were making a bet on behavior change. They were making a bet that the total addressable market would massively increase, and that they themselves would have some force in increasing the total addressable market that was underlying them. But a lot of times you don't want to make this assumption that, okay, well, I'm going to crack this totally open and I'm going to make the whole world start using, blah, 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 whatever the whole world is going to start staking things. And so therefore, like, my staking market is going to be enormous. You can make that argument, but for a lot of times it's just not intellectually going to get you very far if you make the most generous possible assumptions for a total addressable market. So the answer in the end is that you kind of have to use your judgment. So this is not a science, it's an art. And most of the time it's probably wise to try to hold the market static and assume that behavior is not going to change en masse and that the market size isn't going to change en masse. Behavior sometimes just change en masse. Markets sometimes massively grow. But most of the time, the best assumption to make is that the market and the behavior is going to be roughly static, unless you have a very good reason to believe otherwise.
I see, thanks. There's also like another question. Can you provide a resource for determining TAM?
I will circle back asynchronously. There's nothing that comes to mind as a good resource for determining TAM. Very often, again, it depends on the particular vertical that you're targeting, where you want to find the underlying data that's going to be helpful to you. So yeah, there's no single kind of, there's no single repository of data you'd want to pull from. So if you're trying to figure out, what is the, what's the total value or the total addressable market for transaction, anti-money laundering? Well, okay, well, you got to figure out how many exchanges are there? Are these the stereotypical customers? Maybe they're exchanges, maybe they're other businesses. How many total businesses are there in crypto? You want to multiply that by like what you think the market can bear. What are they willing to pay for a single transaction? Blah, blah, blah. You have to do a lot of back of the napkin math, and you're going to end up with a number that is not perfect. But again, it kind of gives you the rough order of magnitude. So it's kind of like, those exercises that, guess how many, or estimate rather, how many piano tuners there are in Chicago. That kind of thing is the kind of thing you do when you're doing a total addressable market calculation. Sometimes you can get very concrete numbers. Most of the time, you have to wing it a bit.
I see. Thanks. I think that's all of the questions for now. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay, excellent. All right. So moving on. So let's talk about bottoms up ideation. So top down is taking the approach of, okay, I'm going to look on the industry on the whole, and then I'm going to decide what I'm going to bet on. Bottoms up ideation kind of starts from the assumption that you want to start with yourself. So as you, the person, the entrepreneur, what is the area that you know best? And if you don't know any area very well, then go spend time in an area, right? I talked earlier about how it's a good idea if you want to get into entrepreneurship to work at a startup. If you work at a startup, you are going to really, really understand a particular area very well. So bottoms up ideation starts from the perspective not of, okay, what does the industry need, but of what can I do? What am I most well suited for? What do I know the most about? So if you find the area that you think, okay, this is an area in which I have a lot of mastery, I have a lot of familiarity, I've spent a lot of time in it, I have a lot of relationships, networks, talent that I can tap into, and I have a lot of ideas, then within the area that in top-down ideation, you generally be thinking, okay, what's the biggest problem that the most people are willing to pay for? Whereas in bottoms-up ideation, you kind of want to ask yourself, what feels to me like the biggest pain point in this space, right? So for example, let's say that you were working at an exchange. And so coming back to the idea of anti-money laundering, kind of transaction monitoring type stuff. Let's say you were working at an exchange and you realize that, like, man, all the tools that we have for like anti-money laundering and compliance are really terrible. They just suck. They take up so much of our time. They're really painful. They have very low fidelity. So that feels to me, from my experience, it feels to me like that's a big problem. And the question that you might want to ask yourself is, okay, well, what's a product that you could build in that space that you would actually use yourself, right? What is sort of, if you could have your way, what is it that you wish you could be using? And that's a different way of getting at the same question, which is, what's the biggest problem in the space? Well, if you know the space very well, if you know it intimately, then it's very often the case that you can just kind of ask yourself internally these questions, which will give you a lot of insight that you couldn't necessarily ask taking a 1,000-foot view. And then, of course, you want to ask yourself, okay, you have this idea, you say, okay, hey, transaction monitoring, anti-compliance. Well, the question you have to ask yourself is, can you actually build that? Do you have the expertise? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the network? Do you have the wedge? Do you have a distribution mechanism? You want to play to your advantages here. So if you're thinking in a bottoms-up way, you already have some commitment, some skills, some knowledge, some network. And given those things, how can you leverage what you have, the relationships you have, the knowledge that you have, the time that you spent, in a way that tackles a meaningful market, solves a meaningful problem, but also plays to your strengths and to your advantages. So that's bottoms-up ideation. And that's the other approach that you can take when you're thinking about how to find a good idea. Any questions there?
Yeah, I think we have like two actually more questions in the channel. So first of all, like, how should we discover the recent innovation and sense their impact to the market structure?
How to understand recent innovations. I mean, basically pay attention, right? Do a lot of reading, sign up for newsletters, talk to people who are in the industry and who are working on the thing that you're working on. You just have to be in the flow of things. And depending on the particular area that you're trying to tackle, there might not be a single place where all of this is readily available to ingest. And so you have to be creative. So when you're trying to delve deep and go all in on a particular market, first go read all the prior work, figure out, what have people written, what have people done, what have people worked on before I showed up that's in the space. Go talk to experts, find people, whether it's on Twitter or on LinkedIn or whatever, cold email them, go find them at conferences, do whatever you need to do to get in touch with the people who are working in this particular space and spend time with them. Ask them a lot of questions, figure out what they're reading, figure out what they spend their time on, who do they listen to, whose tweets do they follow. You want to kind of do this, following breadcrumbs until you get closer and closer to the beating heart of that particular vertical. And that's how you're going to stay abreast of what's really happening in that space.
Cool. And we also have like a question of like, could you give an example of bottoms-up ideation from your perspective, and as in like from your perspective, what would be your bottom idea or problem?
That is a interesting question. Well, so okay, I'm obviously I'm a VC, I'm a fund manager, and so in many ways, I built out this fund in large part through a kind of bottoms-up ideation, but that might be a cop-out answer. If I, knowing what I know, what would be my bottoms-up ideation approach? Well, the first thing I would ask myself is, okay, what am I good at? What network do I have? What relationships do I have that make me particularly well suited for the thing that I can do? Well, I'm a fund manager. I know a lot of other fund managers. I know a lot of investors into funds, and I know a lot of entrepreneurs. And so the place where I would start is I would say, okay, well, that is a network that very few people have. So if I wanted to start a startup, I would think about something that is going to solve a problem that those people have. Because that right now, I mean, I might think I'm a smart guy, I might think I'm capable of building things, but that is certainly my unfair advantage. So given that, and given the fact that I have some distribution, right? So there are a lot of people who follow me, people read my Twitter, people, read the stuff that I put out. And so using those resources, how can I leverage that to build something really valuable and solve a big problem? So I probably would not say, okay, I'm going to go build a layer 1, or I'm going to go build a DeFi protocol, because all those things that I just mentioned to you don't leverage, are not leveraged in any way by me building a layer 1 or me building a DeFi protocol. So probably if I'm thinking about this in a bottoms up way, I would be thinking about something that plays into my strengths in those regards, uses the unique skills that I have, and doesn't require me to really start from zero. Even though I might, in a top-down way, I might say, okay, well, layer 1s are really important, DeFi is really important, but that's not where my skills are going to give me a special advantage. And it's not where I've been spending, I mean, I do spend a lot of my time on those things, but the reality is I was spending almost all my time investing. And so maybe there's some product that investors might use, or some resource that helps investors get in touch with founders, or something, something along those lines. That would be what I would imagine if I'm thinking about this in a bottoms-up type of way.
Thanks. We also have a question about what are like the common pitfalls with the bottom-up ideation approach?
Common pitfalls. I mean, again, this is so much art rather than science. I'd say a very common pitfall is kind of over-optimizing on the area that you know. So you can become too bottoms up and just say, well, I love, I don't know, something super esoteric. Right? I love, K-pop. And so I spend a lot of time in K-pop. And so I'm going to build like, I don't know, an NFT marketplace for K-pop stars. It's like, okay, well, maybe you know some K-pop fans, and I don't know, like you can imagine that there's something there maybe, but the thing is just too narrow, and it's not a big enough pain point for enough people. Like there's just a lot of other issues that when we talk about what are the features of a good idea, you want to make sure that when you're engaging in bottoms up ideation, you're actually looking for the features of a good idea when you're thinking through what idea you want to pursue. So we're going to be talking about that next. So I'll go into more detail about what makes an idea a good idea.
Great. I think considering like the time, we can maybe answer like one of like the relevant question to the current slides. So there are two people asking like what would you decide or evaluate like whether to do top down or bottom up, or what would we recommend, like and specifically like if skills don't give any specific advantage on DeFi or Web3, but Web3 seems exciting. Probably just like how do you decide like whether to do top down or bottom up?
Yeah, I'd say if you're thinking in a bottoms up way, and you're just kind of like, okay, well, I don't really have anything. Like I don't really feel like I'm grounded in any particular part of the crypto, kind of tree of life. I'm just kind of staring at it from the outside. Then naturally you want to do top down, because you have no real entrance point to think about it in a bottoms up way, right? If you don't have a node somewhere on the tree that you're starting from, then you might as well look at the whole thing and figure out what's the best way to get in. So that's generally what I'd say. The more positioned you are, the more experience you have, the more specialized you are, the more that you want to trend toward bottoms up ideation. But it's always okay to do elements of both, right? So you can kind of think about the area that you're in, but think about it in a more top-down way. So every good idea tends to have elements of both.
I see. Great. Thanks for the answer. I think we also have some like general question we can probably answer in the later section of the talk. So yeah, please.
Okay, cool. All right. So let's talk about what makes a good idea. So there are kind of a few core things that you want to look for when you're evaluating an idea and trying to figure out whether or not it's any good. So the first and most important thing about an idea is that your idea should solve a big and clearly articulable problem. Okay. Now, the two keywords here are big and articulable. So it should be a big problem in the sense that, one, it should be a problem that people actually care about. If technically this is kind of a problem, but nobody actually cares, nobody actually is invested in this thing, nobody really feels it particularly deeply, that this is something that they want to exist in the world, then it's not a good idea. So solving a small problem or solving a minor inconvenience, it's just, this becomes like a feature in someone else's product, or it just becomes a very minor innovation that's very unlikely to get customers or very unlikely to be able to charge or capture much value. So that's why it's important that it be big. Being clearly articulable means that you can actually define what the problem is. If you cannot define what the problem is that you're solving, you're probably not solving a problem. So for example, you might say that like, well, this thing is great because it's decentralized. Okay, well, what's the problem you're solving? Right? That's not a problem. Something saying that something has a property. It's like, this thing is really cool, and I think people will like it. Right? Okay, well, that's not a problem that you're solving. Now you might say that, okay, I'm creating this website that allows people to showcase their NFTs in a very easily shareable way. Okay, what's the problem that you're solving? The problem that you're solving is that people who have NFTs don't have a good way to share their NFTs, and that is bad, right? It makes it difficult for people to communicate about NFTs. That's the problem I'm solving. Okay, that's a problem. Is it a big problem? I don't know. Did you solve that big problem? I don't know. Those are the questions you need to ask yourself before you go any further down evaluating an idea. If you're not solving the problem, if the problem's not big, or you can't clearly articulate what exactly it is that you're solving, then it's probably not a good idea. Okay. The second thing about a good idea is that a good idea is defensible. Now, what does defensible mean? Defensible means that if you build this thing and you solve this problem, that you can actually hold on to your place in the market, rather than, okay, you built this thing and it's good, but now anybody can also solve the same problem you solved. The problem is just solved en masse, and there's no way for you to protect your position as, okay, I'm the one who solved this problem, therefore I get to capture it in the value, right? So it's the way this is often described is that a startup idea possesses a moat. And a moat, you can sort of imagine a moat like a castle, right? So a moat is like this protective kind of body of water that prevents other people from crossing into your territory. So when you go and solve a problem, you want it to be defensible so that other people can't come in and capture the value that you created. That's defensibility. So it should be easy to explain. This is a big red flag. If you have a quote unquote good idea, but it's really complicated to explain, then either you are working on, you're building a quantum computer, which I guess is kind of difficult to explain, or more likely, you don't understand your problem well enough. If it is not easy to explain, it is probably not a good idea. I've basically almost never seen in my entire career a good idea that was not easy to explain. Most of the time, if you have an idea that is difficult to explain and that you can't explain it to somebody, a potential customer, potential user, in a simple way that they will understand almost instantly, then probably there is some convolutedness behind your idea that is hiding its weakness. Good ideas almost always are easy to explain. Next, you want to make sure that your idea has a well-defined customer or user. Okay, so you might say like, okay, well, I'm going to solve the ability for people to share NFTs in a seamless way. Okay, let's well, who is this for? Who is going to use this? If you cannot clearly say who are the people who are going to use your product, and instead you kind of say, well, my product is for everyone. Everyone should have NFTs. In that case, it's a little bit simpler because obviously the answer is people who own NFTs are your customer or your user base. But there are a lot of products for whom they really don't know who their customers are. They don't know who their users are. And if you cannot actually segment who your users are, then it becomes very difficult for you to actually be able to take an angle of attack and figure out how to get this in front of them, how to explain this to them in a way that makes sense to them, how to cater their product to their needs. If you don't understand who your customers are, probably your idea is not well defined enough to appeal to a particular group of people. Next, a good idea has a why now. And when I say a why now, I mean, why should this thing exist now? Usually what that's implicitly asking is that, okay, if this is a big problem you're solving, why didn't the solution to this problem already exist? There's a very famous theory in economics called the efficient market hypothesis. And the efficient markets hypothesis, basically what it postulates is that, round to a first order approximation, the efficient markets hypothesis basically says that markets are efficient, meaning that they already price in the relevant information into the market. The way that you'd apply that to startups is to say, if this is a well-defined problem that people have, then somebody else would have built it, right? If this is actually a big problem, if it's easy to understand, and all the technology is already there that allows somebody to build it, then probably somebody would have built it because there was a big prize for them waiting if they did build it. So the why now question is effectively trying to challenge this efficient markets notion. It's asking you, okay, well, if markets are efficient, if entrepreneurs who are all as smart as you and as thoughtful as you, were all looking at this market and they were saying, okay, well, there's this big problem. There's a solution that doesn't take rocket science to figure out. Maybe sometimes it does. Maybe there's like a stroke of insight, but most of the time, it's not a stroke of insight type situation. Why didn't someone build this before you? And the implicit answer, the default answer of the why now, or like, why didn't someone build this before you? The answer is that probably someone did try to build it before you and failed because nobody wants this. The most common way that startups fail, besides co-founder breakups, is nobody wants what they're building. And that should be your default assumption when you create a new startup, is that for most ideas that you have, nobody will actually want it. And if nobody wants it, your startup is going to die. So that's the kernel of the why now question. And what's a good answer to why now? A good answer to why now might be something like, well, nobody ever came along who had my background, who wanted to build this thing. There are very few people who understand zero knowledge proofs. I'm one of them, therefore I can build it. Nobody else could have built it. Another why now could be, well, we just had a big change. DeFi really grew in the last year, and now there are a lot of institutions that need, custodial access to DeFi. That's the why now, because something in the market changed in the last year. Another why now might be that, well, these academic papers were written very recently, but nobody has had time to productionize them. Now we actually have open source code. And so only recently the tools have been enabled for me to build this zero knowledge proof privacy protocol, blah, 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 whatever. Okay. Those are good examples of a why now. Clearly articulates why it took up until now and up until you for this idea, which was, kind of sitting in the constellation of ideas, to get plucked out and built. And then lastly, a good idea has strong value capture. It has a robust business model, i.e., it has high margins, ideally, if it has a kind of traditional margin type model. Okay, so what do I mean by value capture? Value capture, and we'll talk about this in more detail. Value capture basically means that not only do you solve a big problem, but you also capture a large amount of the value that you create with your business. Okay, so an example of something that does not have good value capture is something like, let's say Linux. Okay, Linux is installed as an operating system on many, many machines. The Linux Foundation, which is the organization that created Linux, doesn't capture almost any value from all the value that's been created by Linux. Now, of course, this is intentional. They weren't trying to capture this value. But the value capture of the system is actually very weak because it's created so much incredible amounts of value, but it captures very little of it just because of the nature of, it's hard to monetize an operating system, right? You could argue that the music industry is also an industry that has very weak value capture. People love music. Tons and tons of people listen to music, right? But back in the 90s, in the era of where you'd have to go and buy a CD-ROM to go listen to music from Walmart or Target or whatever, that was an era when music captured an enormous amount of value. Music was an extremely profitable industry. It was growing quickly. They were very high margin. And then since the era of online file sharing, since the era of Spotify and iTunes and all these things that have totally changed the value capture model within the music industry, now music is a very low value capture industry. Basically, music is almost free. Most people never pay for music. And as a result, although music creates a lot of value, people take a lot of enjoyment out of music, it doesn't really capture very much value anymore. So the nature of the business model very often is embedded in the idea itself. Oftentimes has a bearing on your ability to capture value, even if you're able to solve a big problem. So it's not enough to just solve a big problem. You also need to be able to capture some of the value that you create when you solve that big problem. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So I'm going to pause there. Any questions, Xiaoyuan?
Yeah, so I think we have like a few questions about competitions. So first, what's your suggestion if you have like a good idea? And let's say we are confident about it, but there's like a giant competitor in that field. And there's also like a relevant question asking, what if someone is already working on the area, which is answering the why now question, but they aren't like too far ahead? Just to say they identify the same problem as you in the market?
That's a great question. I wish actually in retrospect that I put a slide on competition, but I neglected to do that. So I'll say very briefly my thoughts on competition. So competition is inevitable. And in fact, you actually want competition, because if you don't have competition, the most likely reason why you don't have competition is that you're building something that nobody actually wants. If you're building, basically, if you have a bad idea, nobody's going to come after your market because everyone else is going to realize you have a bad idea. But if you have a good idea, then almost certainly other people are going to be building your space. So if you look at almost all the big, really successful startups, every single one of them had competition. So competition is a sign that you're building the right thing. Now, the nature of that competition is very important, okay? So the first thing I'll say is that when you have a big competitor, you should not, okay, so kind of a few things. So one is that if you have a big competitor, you want to understand, what does this competitor have access to that I don't have access to? Or are there ways in which they're blocking me out of the market? So here are ways in which you want to think about network effects, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about defensibility in more detail. So if they have a strong network effect, or they have some kind of distribution effect, or they have exclusive contracts, or they have something that prevents you from making an entrance into the market, then that can be a disincentive for you to enter that market because of the nature of the competition. But competition in and of itself is not necessarily going to do that. Right? So just because you have a competitor, especially if they're a recent competitor who entered the market before you, to me, I'd say, no, that doesn't mean anything. Just because there's a competitor, if they're another startup, or they're somebody who just, entered the space and they're not doing a great job, or they don't have a lot of very strong lock-in, then go for it. Go, almost every market that is important and that is solving a big problem, there are multiple people working on it, meaning that you should not shrink away from competition. You should embrace it. Now, competition is, again, it's tricky to see through to the eventual details. If your competitors are weak, obviously that's great because it means that you can out-execute them, you can outperform. If your competition is very strong, that might be a disincentive for you to tackle that market, right? So we talked about you want to generally speaking have a bias towards things that are less crowded, and for crowded you want to modulate crowded for how high quality the crowd is in that market, but by and large, don't shy away from competition. Every important market and almost every super successful company has been built in the face of tackling very strong competitors, because when you have a big market and a big prize for winning that market, it's going to attract great competitors. So don't be afraid of that.
Thanks. We also have a question about, let's say once we have like a good problem, how can we adopt the solution to target like a niche population? Or do we necessarily want to like niche a startup?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't fully understand.
Oh, so the question is like, if we already have like a good problem, how can we adopt a solution to target like a, let's say like a small population? Or do we necessarily want like to target only like a small population for a startup?
This is a good question. So very often you want to target a small and focused population first. Even if the eventual total addressable market for your product is very big, it generally makes sense to start small and focused, because if you start small and focused, then you can really cultivate a product that people are going to love. So one of the important principles, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about product in a later lecture. One of the important principles when you're building any product is that it is much more valuable to build a product that people love than a product that people like. When people like a product, it means that they're willing to take it, but if you kind of throw too much friction at them, they'll just drop it, right? And you guys there are probably a lot of things on your phone that you've installed that you try it out, it's cool, it's okay, but like if they start sending you a bunch of notifications, you're just going to uninstall the app. Right? You're just not going to deal with it. But there's some things that are on your phone that you love, and that you will go through all sorts of bullshit just to use this product because you love this product, because it's great. It's so important to you. It is so much more valuable to build something that feels like the latter than that feels like the former. And the best way to do that is to start with a focused audience, a focused customer base, and build something that is perfectly tailored for them. And if you can do that, if you can make it really delightful and wonderful to that group of people, then you can, over time, expand your product offering outwards to more and more people. That's the way generally I would think about how to tailor what you're building to a particular group of people, and then expanding out over time.
Yeah, I think there are also like more general questions which can be potentially answered in the later phase of the lecture. So maybe we can move on.
Okay, we'll hold those. Cool. Okay, so I want to dive a little bit into some of the features of a good idea that I mentioned earlier. So we'll start with talking about solving a problem. So you want to ask the question, when you're talking about, okay, do I solve a big problem? Is you want to ask, why will users use this product? What problem does it solve? And for whom does it solve that problem? Okay, so you want to get really focused. You want to be really concrete. If you can't articulate both parts of this question, of both who will use it, or sorry, why will they use it, and what problem does it solve, then you're in trouble. That means probably you don't understand this problem well enough, or your problem, or sorry, your product doesn't actually solve the problem in a particularly direct way. It's oftentimes a good idea as well when you're thinking about your users to think in terms of like a user profile. So imagine like the stereotypical user that you would have, maybe even give them a name. This is a very common thing done in marketing research. So you might say, okay, my stereotypical customer is somebody who, day trades NFTs. Okay. Well, what is that customer like? Well, they're probably in their early 30s. It's a guy named Nathan who lives in Virginia, has some disposable income. And, he just, every day after work, he like checks Reddit and like, hangs out in Discords and blah, blah, blah. Right. So you want to really imagine, who is this person? Who is the stereotypical user of your product, and make your product as delightful as possible for that particular person. And over time, you can start expanding, adding more kind of, user stories or kind of user profiles that you imagine as being, different representatives of your stereotypical users. Okay, now you want to ask, how bad is the problem? How severe is it? How important is it? Is the thing you're building a nice to have or a must have? Right. And that's when I was talking about something that people love or something that people like. This is kind of another way of describing the same thing. Is so much more valuable to build a must have than to build a nice to have. And so if you cannot really articulate why is the thing you're building a must have for the people who are your customers or your users, then probably your idea, could use some work or some more focus. And lastly, if you're building something that is getting more enterprise type product that has direct cost savings, you want to ask, does using my product directly result in some kind of cost savings or some other direct utility, increased revenue or something else like that for the individual or the company that's going to be using it? So for example, if you're building tax software, one of the concrete questions you can ask is, does this save people money relative to other tax software, right? If I'm doing like some fancy tax loss harvesting or something else, it's like, okay, this results in money saved. Or if you're building something that, let's say you're building some kind of, crypto marketplace, anti-fraud detection tools. It's like, okay, well, this saves you, hiring 2 engineers to like build anti-fraud tools for you. Instead, you just integrate this. So that directly results in a cost savings for your company, right? And that gives you, okay, how bad is this problem? You can quantify that if you can quantify the actual cost savings. And you can ask very clearly, what problem does it solve? Right. And the answer is, okay, well, it solves this problem of anti-fraud, but also it particularly saves people money when they're trying to build a company that needs to engage in anti-fraud. So those are both 2 different angles of attack on the same statement. So that's some high level on solving a problem. Shay, if you have any questions on these kind of zoom in slides, just stop me and go ahead and ask. But I'm gonna move on and talk about, okay, that's on solving a problem. Let's zoom in a bit on defensibility. So what makes something defensible? What gives it a moat? So literally when I say defensible, when I say a moat, what it means is that competitors cannot easily enter the market or overtake your market share. So very often, if you're building something defensible, it means that you're cornering the market very quickly, or just that your product is so much better than anybody else out there. And it's very difficult for people to become as good as you for whatever reason. Now, the most common way that you build something that's defensible and that is going to soak up market share and not give anything away is because it has a network effect. So a network effect is a term when somebody using your product makes your product incrementally better, such that the more people use your product, the better and better it becomes. And it becomes harder and harder for a small product that doesn't have that many people to be competitive with your product. So there's some very obvious examples of products that have network effects. So Facebook is a stereotypical network effect, right? It's a social media platform. Almost all social media platforms have network effects, such that if you start a new Facebook, it's really hard for that new Facebook to become popular relative to Facebook, because the value of a system, a social media network, is proportional to how many people are there. And so if all of your friends are on Facebook, right, which I mean, nowadays probably, you guys are at Berkeley, you probably don't use Facebook, but all your friends are on some social network, the value of the social network is proportional to how many of your friends are on there. If there's only like 1 or 2 of your friends on it, it's just not that valuable. And so the platform that has everyone on it just breaks away as being way more valuable than any other competitor. And contenders have a really, really hard time building up any kind of angle of attack on a network effect like a social media platform. Now in crypto, you have the equivalent. You have something like Ethereum, which is itself, literally a network. And so it has a network effect. The more people who use Ethereum, more people who integrate Ethereum, the more people who buy things on Ethereum, and the value of Ethereum, all these things kind of, they have a flywheel. They all kind of influence each other. And that makes it really difficult for a new network to get up and running and try to challenge Ethereum. It's not impossible, but it's a tough network effect to overcome. The same thing is true of Binance, right? Binance is an exchange. Exchanges have a network effect around liquidity and around users and around market makers and around assets. The more users you have, the more assets you can list, the more liquidity you develop for those assets. Liquidity, by the way, means the ability to buy and sell at any given time. This is a huge network effect. And so it's very difficult for a new contender to come in and unseat Binance because they just have so much liquidity. And liquidity begets liquidity, and that's where people want to trade because it's where you can get the best price performance. It's where the most assets are, and that makes it difficult for new contenders to make inroads on Binance's network effect. So let me pause there for a second. Any questions, Xiaoyuan?
Yeah, I think there are like a few interesting questions that might. Yeah, so one of them is like, how viable is patient trolling as a mode?
Patent trolling.
Yeah.
So okay, that's an interestingly phrased question. So I think what you perhaps meant to ask was, are patents usable as a moat? They are. They are classically, they're one of the common ways that technology companies defend their innovations is through patents. So a patent is basically, a patent is something you file with the U.S. Patent Office, and there are obviously different countries have different patent systems. That basically gives you the exclusive license to be able to profit from a particular invention. And you can obviously license this out to other people if you want to say, hey, I have the patent for this thing, but you can also use it if you pay me a fee. But if you invent something, you get if you invent something and you patent it, you get an exclusive license to be able to use it without other people being able to use it. Now, in crypto, patents are much less common because, of course, almost everything in crypto is open source, and there's a spirit in crypto of being able to share, openly innovate, and allow things like forks and kind of open competition. Now, there are some things that are patented. Of course, it's not everything, but most protocols in crypto are basically developed out in the open. They're completely open source, and therefore, there are not patents that are defending these things. So now, patent troll. The question actually mentioned patent trolls. Patent trolls are something very different. Patent trolls are basically, they're kind of rent-seeking firms that acquire patents from oftentimes failing companies or companies that just don't have a lot of use for them. Generally, they acquire very vague patents. So patents that usually should not really actually be patents at all, because patents are supposed to be very specific. But there's some patents that are very vague because some judge just kind of lets them through, and there's a patent judge just doesn't know what they're doing. And so there's some vague patent like, this is a patent on sending inter-protocol communications using, wireless networking, right? Which is like, what the hell is that? That's so vague. That could be like everything. Everything is, sending inter-protocol communication through wireless networking. But if somebody can manage to sneak through a patent on that, they can say, great, I have this patent, and a bunch of people are using my innovation, which is sending inter-protocol communications through wireless networking. So I'm going to sue them and say, you need to pay me for using my patent. And these firms are called patent trolls because they just acquire these kind of bullshit patents and they sue people for them. And the problem is that defending a patent case is actually quite expensive. So it can cause, it can cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So very often, or in the millions, depending on the complexity of the patent case. And so a lot of firms will just settle with the patent troll and just pay the money and say, okay, just go away, give me the license. I'll pay you, $50,000 or $100,000 just to go away and leave me alone. And unfortunately, this is a line of business. That's called a patent troll. Totally irrelevant to this. I don't know that I really need to go into that, but that's what a patent troll is. It has nothing to do with startups. So patents in crypto, not so much of a thing. So usually when you're building a technology in crypto, your moat needs to be something that's not a patent. It can still be closed source. So for example, if you're building a infrastructure product, right, you're allowing people to get real-time analytics on DeFi or NFT trading. Okay, well, you have your own code base. Your code base doesn't have to be open source, right? Very often, if it's a centralized company, you're not going to open source your code base, but it doesn't necessarily mean also you need to get a patent. I don't know that a patent is going to do a whole lot for you if you're building a pretty generic type startup like an analytics company. So, any other questions?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, you just answered like another question about like the mode for like open source project. So yeah, there's also like another question for like, do you have any thoughts on using trade secrets versus patents?
Do I have any thoughts on trade secrets versus patents? Not really. Again, patents are not widely used within crypto or Web3. again, they're kind of considered to be against the spirit. So basically, a trade secret is something that you don't patent, because if you patent something, you have to actually publish it openly, meaning that anybody can see what it is. A trade secret is a secret. You don't want anyone to know what it is. So all patents are filed with the US Patent Office, meaning that you can go look them up. You know, if you just go to the US Patent Office online, you can look up literally every single patent that's ever been filed. If you have something that is a secret, right? So like, you know, the KFC formula or whatever, or the Coke formula, these are trade secrets. These are not patented. If they were patented, that means we would all know what they are. And so anybody could go and recreate it. Now, you couldn't legally sell it because you'd have to pay them the licensing fee for the patent, or they would just refuse to give you a license. But technically, you know what it is. A trade secret is something that is not patented. So therefore, you have no you have no defense if somebody independently arrives at your trade secret, right? So for example, if somebody's innovating and they're trying to copy Coke, and you have your formula for how to generate Coke, right? Coca-Cola, not, if you have your own formula for generating Coca-Cola, and somebody else on the other side of the world just like tries those random ingredients and they also arrive at the same answer, you cannot then go and patent it, because you did not have somebody else also knew this thing before you did, and therefore you can't patent Coke anymore. Now it's just open out in the public. Anybody can use the idea for Coke. So patenting generally is kind of a way to preempt the dissemination of a trade secret. So for example, if you're building a consumer product, right? Let's say you're building hardware. So this is one thing in crypto, like people build mining hardware. If you want to patent your mining hardware, which you may want to, the reality is that like a good reason to patent hardware is because hardware is going to be sold. And so if you sell it to a consumer, anybody can go take your hardware, open it up and look inside and see how it works. And so if you have a quote unquote trade secret, well, okay, well, it's there in the hardware, right? People have it in their hands. They can do anything they want with it. And so that makes it very difficult to have hardware really use trade secrets. So that's why they often rely on patents. Whereas, there are other kinds of businesses, like for example, if you're starting your own infrastructure company that is doing some fancy technique to query, query blockchain data in a super efficient way. I don't know, this is a kind of vague example. You might use that as a trade secret and not make it not patent it, because if you patent it, other people can use it. Now, technically, you could go sue them if they use it, but how do you know they're using it? Is it possible for you to really detect whether your patent is being infringed? If not, then the patent is kind of useless and you'd rather just make it a trade secret. The only way that you can prosecute somebody for violating your trade secret is if you can prove that somebody who is in your company leaked the trade secret, right? If somebody just arrived at your trade secret independently, then it's no longer a secret. It's just something that multiple people invented at the same time. So that's the nuance between a trade secret and a patent. Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks. I think there are also another relevant question. So speaking of network effect, what are some effective or sustainable way in Web3 to acquire users to get network effect flywheel going?
So this is a general question. It gets kind of to the next point that I was going to make in the slide. So I'll cover this and hopefully that will address the question. So we talked about a network effect. A network effect is, again, this flywheel that you have more people joining your network that makes your network more and more valuable, or joining your product or whatever. And that kind of, this flywheel it's sort of this positive feedback loop, right? It keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. That's how all the social media platforms classically grew, is through these network effects. But it's not the only form of defensibility. Some things do not have network effects. So there are other forms of defensibility, though, that allow your product to become more defensible over time as it grows. So one example of defensibility is economy of scale. There's a scale effect. It's not a network effect, right? So for example, as you get bigger, one thing that you might do is you say, okay, well, my development team doesn't need to get bigger even if my application gets bigger. So that's an economy of scale, meaning you become more efficient the larger you are. Let's say, just to give you an illustrative example, let's say you're running an exchange. Exchanges do have network effects. Let's pretend they didn't. If you have an exchange then your engineering team to build the exchange, to run just the trading engine and the margin system and all that stuff, it's a fixed cost, right? You need, let's say, 10 engineers in order to build this thing. Well, you may have an economy of scale, and the bigger you get, the easier it is to run the marginal dollar of trading volume that goes through your business, right? And so there's a fixed cost to running your exchange, but the relative profitability of your exchange increases, which allows you to compete more and more on price, right? You can give more money back because you need to capture less rent from each individual trade in order to pay for your development team. So that gives you an economy of scale. Another economy of scale might be, for example, let's say you're running a hardware business, right? So you're building Bitcoin miners. Well, if you're a small player, it's very difficult for you to get time at a fab because the fab, the people that actually manufacture the actual the ASICs that you're building for your mining business, they generally are more willing to work with large parties. And so a large party, you can basically take time on an entire fab by yourself as opposed to renting it for somebody else, and that's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's faster. You have a direct relationship with the fab. Whereas somebody who's a small player, a small miner, they're not going to get that. And so that's an economy of scale. It's not a network effect. It's not that every single person who buys your miner makes each miner more valuable. That would be a network effect. But economy of scale just means the bigger you are, the better pricing power you have. And so pricing power is the other element of it. So pricing power generally means that you have the ability to squeeze your suppliers in a way that other people don't. So pricing power might mean, for example, that your product uses, I don't know, I mean, imagine some manufacturing, right? So like you have, you are yourself the largest user of, I don't know, nickel, okay, just as a raw material. And because you're such a large buyer of nickel, you have pricing power over nickel, meaning that you have the ability to dictate to the nickel market what you're willing to pay. And that pricing power is not necessarily available to all startups in that market, right? So if a startup is too small, or they just don't have the relationship, or they don't have the pricing power, they don't have some adjacent advantage, that can give you defensibility if you have that pricing power. So you can buy something cheaper than somebody else can buy, improving your input costs. Another form of defensibility is a first mover advantage. So this can simply be that you have a brand effect because you were the first one here. It can simply be that you were the first one to sign exclusive contracts, right? So let's say you're an NFT marketplace and you went and you signed Snoop Dogg to launch NFTs on your marketplace, and you were just first, and so you got Snoop Dogg. And if somebody else was first, they would have gotten Snoop Dogg, but you got him. So that's a first mover advantage, right? You have this advantage that you're the first one there, and you have all this credibility, or you have all these relationships, or you have all these exclusive contracts. Another source of defensibility is cost of capital. So what this means is that a lot of businesses, they need working capital. So they need to borrow money or they need to raise money in order to be able to fund themselves. So if you have superior cost of capital, what that means is that it's easier for you to raise money, or it's easier for you to borrow money than other people. Now, why might it be easier for you to raise money or borrow money than other people? It might be because you have a great pedigree. It might be, it's defensible because you came from a big bank, or you have an investor from a big bank, or you spun out from a big bank. And that big bank is therefore willing to underwrite you better than they would, some random, Berkeley kid who comes out with a startup and is like, hey, I want to borrow $10 million. It's like, okay, well, you're just a kid. Like, I don't trust you. So it's going to be a lot more expensive for you to borrow. I'm going to need you to pay a higher interest rate or put up more collateral. Whereas if you have a very strong reputation, then your cost of capital can be very low, which can be a form of defensibility. So again, it lowers the capital structure for your business. Another form of defensibility is access to talent. If you spin out of Facebook, if you spin out of Stanford or Berkeley, you might have access to great talent that other people don't. And this can give you some defensibility, right? So I can tap these great engineers that other people can't get access to, or just I'm charismatic. People love me. They want to work for me. So therefore I have access to talent that other people don't have. That's a defensibility. And then the last form of defensibility, which is probably the weakest, is execution. And really what this means is that my startup is defensible because I'm going to out execute my competitors. I just have a reputation, or I have the ability to just move faster, ship faster, be more efficient than my competitors. This is kind of the weakest form of defensibility. If anything, it's not really a defensibility. It's just like you're kind of running faster on the treadmill than the person next to you. But it's like everything else here, ideally, is like, you and your competitors are both running on treadmills, but you have an incline, right? And your incline, the stronger your defensibility, whether it's a network effect or economy of scale or pricing power, whatever, the steeper your incline, the easier it is for you to run and outrun your competitors. That's the way to think about defensibility. So I'll pause there. Any other questions on those categories? Also, I know that we're running late on time, so I don't want to dwell too long on this slide, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, I think like most are general questions, so maybe we can just proceed.
Great, okay. All right, now let's talk about value capture. So that was the other thing I mentioned as being important to a good idea. A good idea should be able to capture value. Although I mentioned this as being important, I also want to underline that you should not stress out too much about value capture in the beginning. Okay, why do I say that? I say that because in the beginning, the most important thing is just to solve a big problem. If you solve a big problem, you're going to create a lot of value. And the iron rule of all startups is that the amount of value you can capture is proportional to the amount of value you can create. If you're not creating value, you can't capture value, period. Okay. And the upper bound on how much value you can capture is the value you create. Now, generally speaking, you cannot capture 100% of the value you create unless you are some kind of tycoon or something, like this is extremely rare. Most of the time, if you're creating some value, you are taking some of the value and your customers are taking some of the value. If literally you charge your customers exactly as much value as you are offering them, then they would be indifferent to using your product, right? So if your product was a tax software that saved them $100 on their taxes and you charge them $100 for the product, then there's no reason for them to use it, right? So there's always some split of value. Some value you create and you give to the user, some value you create and you capture, and that's the deal. And the higher the value capture basically means that that's the sort of the rev share, or the split between you and the customer. The more you capture value, the less value your customer is taking home and the more you are taking home as the founder or the startup or the business or whatever. So now, of course, tokens and equity capture value in different ways. And there are many ways in which tokens capture value. We'll discuss this in detail in the lecture on tokenomics. So I'm going to put a bookmark there, and we're not going to go into detail about how tokens capture value. But we'll focus a little bit more on the equity side. How do companies capture value? There are many different pricing models for which equity companies can capture value. I'm going to talk about them briefly. So here I'm imagining like, an exchange or a brokerage or a tax company or a analytics company, right? And generally speaking, very, very, very broadly speaking, this is going to be, by the way, a very short shrift of pricing, which could be a lecture in and of itself. But generally speaking, these pricing models are going in decreasing order of attractiveness. Okay, so the best pricing model you can have is what's called value pricing, and value pricing basically means that you figure out how much value is this creating for your customer, and then you charge a percentage of that value, right? So if this customer is going to make $1 million using your product, then you charge 80% of that or 50% of that or whatever. You take half of the $1 million, right? This is value pricing. This is like the best form of pricing. If you can actually do this, then you are getting as close as possible to the pure essence of value capture, which is that I'm creating value with this product and you and I are going to split it. So this is like a rev share. The next form of pricing is transaction pricing. Okay, so transaction pricing basically says every time you make a transaction, I'm going to take a cut of that transaction. Okay, now this is kind of like value pricing because you can assume when you're making a transaction through my software, through my platform, that you are capturing some value because otherwise you wouldn't want to do that transaction, and I'm splitting some of that with you by taking a cut of every transaction you do. Right. So, for example, Coinbase. Part of the reason why exchanges are great businesses is that they do transaction pricing. Every time you trade on an exchange, a cut of your trade goes to the exchange, right? So the casino kind of, they sort of take their rake on every single transaction. And that is an approximation of value pricing because, again, you wouldn't make a trade if you thought there wasn't some chance of the trade being successful and making you money. And so if you're willing to make the trade, you sort of split the profit, so to speak, with Coinbase or with whatever other exchange takes it. So there are other forms of transaction pricing. So there's things like Fireblocks, which does transaction pricing. There are other applications that every time that you make an interaction, they take a cut, and they assume through the rough mathematics through the rough calculus that they're basically taking some kind of value split with you by doing that transaction pricing. The next form of pricing is recurring SaaS. So SaaS stands for software as a service. Basically, this means that you're paying some kind of recurring revenue, some recurring subscription by the number of seats or by the number of enterprises that you're paying for. So, for example, something like Masari is a data company. You might say, okay, every single person on your team who wants to use Masari, they have to pay $50 a month, right? This is sort of recurring subscription revenue. It's pretty good, but like you can clearly tell, look, how much value are you getting out of your Masari subscription? It really depends. Some people are getting a lot, some people are getting a little. By having one price for everyone who's using Masari, you're kind of papering over all the differences, right? What you really want to do is know how much value are you getting out of this product? And I'm going to take half that value. That would be an awesome pricing model. But how do you do that for like a data business or like for an information business? It's extremely hard to do. There's no real way to do it. And so as a result, the value capture of that business is much lower because I can't really tell how much value you're capturing. And the other thing to understand why is this bad, right? Intuitively, you might think like, well, these are all kind of different ways of charging people money. Why are some way better than others? The answer or the intuition I can give you is that when you're thinking about pricing, there is a spectrum of how much value people are getting from your product. A few people are getting an enormous amount of value from your product. A lot of people are getting a medium amount, and then some people are getting almost nothing. Okay, and if you are one of the few people that's getting a lot of value out of the product, those people are where almost all of your value is getting created. And so you want to charge those people a lot of money. because they're making almost all the value that you're actually potentially creating. But it's hard to do that unless you actually have some kind of value pricing or transaction pricing. If you're doing a subscription model, right, where everyone pays $50 a seat, then the people who are making, 100,000 a year from the value of your product, and the people who are making $60 a year from the value of your product, they're both paying $50 a month, right? That means you're leaving so much value on the table because of the nature of your pricing model. So this is one of the reasons why it's very important when you're creating a subscription model type business that you have multiple price tiers. And what that does is it's kind of a crude way of bucketing. Okay, if you're somebody who's making, $100,000 a year from my product, I'm going to have a separate kind of tax bracket for you that has more of the features that people who are like you care about. And I'm going to charge much more for that one, right? So that one's going to be $10,000 a month. Whereas the normal product, that a lot of randos who don't really get a lot of value out of my product, there's going to have much fewer features that, they don't care about the fancy stuff. I'm going to give them a $50 a month offering. So this is why very often, SaaS or subscription companies, they have these different tiers. It's to approximate what they'd otherwise be getting if they could actually do value pricing. But it's a crude way of doing it. And it's why it's not as fine-grained or as effective of a way of capturing that value that you're creating as these other types of business models. And then lastly, the worst form of pricing is services pricing. And services pricing generally means that you are, somebody is paying you for you doing some work for them, right? So they're paying you. So this is like what a plumber does. A plumber does service pricing. And what is the pricing model of service pricing? Basically, they're charging you for time and materials, right? That's service pricing. So service pricing is basically the closest you can think of to commodity pricing. Commodity pricing is the opposite of value pricing. Commodity pricing means that there's unbridled price competition in this market. And so the price of this service has been competed down to basically cost plus epsilon. Okay, what does that mean? Cost plus epsilon basically means that if let's say I'm going to do some kind of consulting, let's say I'm a plumber. Okay, if I'm a plumber, then how much can I charge you for my plumbing services? I can't ask you, hey, how valuable is plumbing to you? It's like, well, plumbing's really valuable. If I don't have plumbing, my life's gonna suck. So it's really, really valuable. And I say, okay, well, I'm gonna charge you $10,000 because you say your plumbing is really valuable. That's like $10,000 worth of value. So I'm going to charge you $10,000. You can't do that. Why can't you do that? The reason why you can't do that is that there's some other plumber who will show up and say, well, instead of charging you $10,000, I'm going to charge you $9,000. And some other plumber says, well, I'll do it for $8,000. And then some other plumber says, I'll do it for $5,000. And finally, some plumber says, well, look, my hourly rate that I can get elsewhere is $60 an hour. So I'll charge you $61 an hour, right? Okay, well, that's price competition. That's unbridled price competition that brings down the cost of this service to basically the cost of just raw materials and wages, right? So that causes this thing to be priced at cost plus. So you take some small margin, some small kind of additional rent on top, but that's it. Besides that, you don't get anything else. This is the worst kind of business because it means that even if you're creating a lot of value, you're not capturing almost any value. It's great for consumers. Consumers want everything to be commodity pricing. Consumers don't want value pricing because value pricing means that you're sharing a lot of the value that you're capturing with this product from the person who created the product. Commodity pricing means that even if you're making tons of value from this product, you pay a fixed cost, right? And a lot of what has resulted, I mean, again, this is the inverse of what you want as an entrepreneur, but in many ways, what's best for the world is that, or best for consumers, is that, for example, the internet is one of the most valuable things in my life. I could not live without the internet. The internet is I would pay so much money. If somebody were to tell me, I'm going to take away the internet forever unless you pay me $100,000, I would do it. But I don't pay that for the internet. I pay, some tiny amount like for monthly because the internet is a commodity now. And I pay commodity pricing for the internet, and thank God, because same thing, water. Water is not value priced, right? Water is commodity priced because water is a commodity because you can import it, export it, anyone can give you water. So, but as a startup, you do not want to become like the internet. You do not want to become like water. You want to become unique, and therefore people will interact with you in a value-based kind of way. Any particular questions on this slide? Otherwise, I want to move on. I'm like halfway through the presentation. I'm realizing that we're dragging a bit, so I'm going to have to move a bit faster.
Yeah, maybe we can.
Any burning questions?
Okay. Later.
Cool. Okay. So I want to give this illustration. There's a great blog post written by this guy, Christopher Yance, called The 5 Ways to Build a $100 Million Business. And I want to illustrate this just so you can get an idea of the different kinds of ways in which you can build a big business in crypto or really in anything. But this is kind of more, particularly this is kind of more traditional software companies, but it's still illustrative. Okay. So on the right side, the right axis or the horizontal axis is the number of customers, and the vertical axis is basically the average revenue per account or per user. So here are the 5 ways to build a $100 million business. So you can go hunting for basically tens of millions of flies, and each of those flies pays you $10 a year. Well, if you have tens of millions of flies and each of them pays $10 a year, then you're making $100 million a year. And $100 million a year at a 10x multiple basically gives you $1 billion business. Okay, so if you have something like a social media platform that's monetizing their customers at $10 a year, great. You need 10 million users in order to get a $1 billion business. Okay, but what if you're getting more money per user, right? What if you're a something like Photoshop, right? Photoshop is a company, you charge maybe $100 a year for like a creative that uses $10 a month or what, I don't know what Photoshop charges, but let's say it's that. Well, okay, you need, instead of having 10 million users, you need 1 million users. So 1 million people paying $100 a year for Photoshop gets you to $1 billion business. Then next is like, I think what is it, dog or gopher, I don't know what that is, but that says that you have 100,000 users, each of them are paying $1,000 a month. Okay, so this is like a fairly high value contract. So $1,000, sorry, not a month, a year. $1,000 a year would be like you're paying for Greenhouse or Salesforce or one of these like kind of fancy enterprise type products. Consumers are generally not paying $1,000 a year. This is, generally speaking, now you're moving into enterprise type products, but you don't need an entire world of enterprises. 100,000 is like a lot, but it's not every single business in the world. Now, if you start getting to like the big game hunting, if you have 10,000 customers and they're each paying $10,000 a year, that is actually enough to get you to $100 million a year in revenue. So, what are people willing to pay $10,000 a year for? Well, something like Chainalysis, people might be willing to pay $10,000 a year, right? That's like the real serious contract. And then lastly, you could go elephant hunting. Elephant hunting basically means that you are getting $100,000 contracts. This is like a Palantir, right? This is like, I'm going and getting these big juicy contracts. And I don't need that many users. If I have 1,000 people that are willing to pay $100,000 a year, that's $100 million a year in revenue. That gets me to $1 billion business. So I think this chart is very useful because it illustrates the fact that there are many different points on the spectrum that allow you to get to the same revenue number, but it gives you an intuition for how big does my business need to be based on how much it's monetizing in order to build a really massive business. Now, obviously, this applies more to equity than it does to tokens, right? So if you're building a layer 1, this is not a super illustrative example, but I think it's useful as a framework for thinking about what the kind of scale of an idea needs to be for it to be able to result in an attractive business. Okay, I'm going to keep breezing through, and then we're going to circle back for questions at the end. So, should you build a moonshot, or should you go for a sure win? So, what is a moonshot? A moonshot is the term in the industry for basically somebody who's trying to take a really big swing, somebody who's trying to build something huge, super hard problem to solve, and it's kind of crazy, maybe even it's very ambitious, but if it works, it's going to be absolutely massive. Or do you go for a sure win? Do you go for, okay, it's not the most revolutionary idea, but if it works, it's a good business, right? So how do you decide whether you want to go for a moonshot idea or for a sure win? Well, it's important to understand startup returns are power law distributed. Okay, this means they follow an exponential return profile. It means almost all returns come from the moonshot successes. Okay, so if you remember back to the very first lecture, I showed those startup valuations, right? Of the overall market cap of all startups, an enormous amount of them are just like the top 20, which means that almost all the value that gets created from startups gets created by a relatively small number of them. And so that implies that expected value-wise, if you're just maximizing expected value, you may want to optimize for building a moonshot. But of course, the failure rates for moonshots are extremely high. It's very likely if you're building a moonshot that you're just going to walk away with nothing, and that you're going to, your project is going to result in a failure. Now, there's an upside to building a moonshot, which people talk about. We talked earlier about one of the forms of defensibility is through talent, access to talent. One of the things about building a moonshot, and one of the reasons why you might want to build it, is that a lot more people will be willing to work for you if you're building a moonshot. A lot more people will be excited to back you if you're building a moonshot, because moonshots are exciting. Moonshots get people motivated. They're energizing, right? Whereas if you're building a sure win, you say, look, I have a lot of connections in the EU for people who are trying to adapt their, NFT exchanges to micro regulations. So I'm going to build a product that allows, an NFT marketplace to, or NFT product to adapt to EU micro regulations. Okay, that's like a sure win kind of business. Where it's not a huge business, it's not going to take over the world. The biggest company in the world is not going to be something that adapts NFT marketplaces to micro regulations, but that's a business. I'm sure that you can get customers and you can do something, right? But like, it's going to be much harder for you to attract great talent to a company that is doing something small and kind of, very obvious and straightforward than for something that's really doing something big and ambitious. People love people who are working on things that are big and ambitious, and it creates a kind of gravitational force around you if you're building something really big. So now, of course, if you're building something that's a sure win, a lot of the sure wins are okay, but they're unlikely to become venture scale. Okay, now what do I mean by venture scale? Venture scale means that it's very unlikely that venture capitalist is going to back something that's building something very, very small. Because as a venture capitalist, if I'm investing a few $1 million into a startup, I need the potential for it to become a 20x, 50x, 100x type outcome. I need it to be able to grow extremely large. If it can't grow extremely large, then the math of venture capital just doesn't work. And the risk reward profile is not what I need in a venture capital portfolio. So I'm not going to invest. It may be good for other kinds of investors. So there are a lot of non-venture capitalist investors. We'll talk about this more when we talk about raising money. But for venture capitalists in particular, they tend not to like investing into kind of sure win type bets that are small ideas. They're very likely to have an outcome or an exit, but those exits are going to be very muted. It's more likely that smaller time investors are going to be more interested in those kinds of businesses. So a very common type of sure win startup is what I like to call X on Y. So what is X on Y? X on Y is like, okay, you know that Uber works. So we're going to build Uber in Indonesia. Okay, that's X on Y. Or like Amazon works, we're going to build Amazon in Argentina. Okay, so these are kinds of ideas that's like very obvious. It's probably going to work. Like somebody's going to make that thing happen. It's not Amazon, right? Amazon was like a moonshot. Amazon was, I think that people are going to buy everything online someday in the future. That's a moonshot. That's a crazy idea, or at least it was at the time when Jeff Bezos was first building Amazon. But now that Amazon is a proven thing, now it's just an X on Y, right? You take this idea and you launch it on this other thing. So another example of this might be, OpenSea is a great NFT exchange. I'm going to build OpenSea for Cardano. Okay, that's X on Y. It's basically, you imagine this like matrix of startup ideas and platforms to build them on. X on Y is you just pick a point in the matrix that nothing exists yet, and you say, great, I'm going to build the X on the Y. So there's a great quote that I actually just read recently by Anthony Pompliano that I think summarizes this very well, is that you can escape competition two ways. Either do something no one else is doing, which is a moonshot, or do it somewhere no one else is doing it. That's an X on Y, right? So if you have a Y that is empty, doesn't have an X on it already, then you can escape competition by building your X on your Y. The problem, of course, is that Y is small. So almost always, again, it's kind of talking about the sufficient market hypothesis. If there's no X on the Y, it's either that Y is small or that X is small. Those are usually the reasons why, if you're doing an X on Y type startup, there's no X on that Y quite yet. So ultimately, of course, it's up to you whether or not you want to build a moonshot or you want to go for a sure win. But the thing about moonshots is that moonshots tackle the biggest problems that are out there, right? So if you think about the last 3 years, what have been the big moonshot startups in crypto? I'd say something like, Solana was a moonshot. Solana was, I'm going to build a faster blockchain. I'm going to build it from the ground up. I would totally re-envision how how blockchains are going to be built. And I'm going to build the fastest blockchain. That's a moonshot. OpenSea is, NFTs back when OpenSea first launched were completely illiquid. They were just issued and then no one, they weren't really traded on external marketplaces. And OpenSea said, I'm going to create a marketplace that creates liquidity for NFTs. And that was a big problem, right? There were NFTs and there was no liquidity. How can you do that? Well, OpenSea had an idea how to do it. Uniswap said, I want to create the best way to trade tokens. Token trading sucks. I want to build a better way to do it. It was a huge problem and they managed to solve it. But remember, most moonshots fail. And so ultimately this comes down to your own appetite for risk and reward, whether or not you want to pursue a moonshot or if you want to, go take a more safe approach to building something. Okay, before you commit to your idea, you need to study the idea maze. Okay, now what is the idea maze? The idea maze is this concept that was first coined by Balaji Srinivasan, who's a very well-known investor in crypto, but also in general technology. The idea maze, the way he originally articulated it, actually, it was through this diagram. And this is the idea maze, quote unquote, for music. So let's say that you are a founder and you're like, I want to build something for doing music on the internet. Okay. Well, the way that Balaji put it, and there's this quote that I'm just going to read aloud, but I'm going to show you the graphic as I read it. A good founder is capable of anticipating which turns lead to treasure and which lead to certain death. A bad founder is just running to the entrance of the music file sharing P2P maze or the photo sharing maze without any sense of the history of the industry, the players in the maze, the casualties of the past, and the technologies that are likely to move walls and change assumptions. So if you are a founder and you are committing to a space, let's say, you want to get into DeFi, you want to get into on-chain lending, you want to get into staking as a service. You don't just want to run to the entrance of the maze and start running around and trying different corridors, okay? Because there are a lot of people who came there before you. And it's very important that you kind of do your history, do your archaeology, and figure out who was in this maze before me. What paths did they go down? What were the mistakes that led them to certain death? And how can I avoid them? Or how do I have a mental model of why it is that I can navigate this maze to make different choices than the people who made them before me? If you don't even know who are the people who came before you, you are absolutely doomed to repeat their mistakes. But if you know, then maybe you have a chance that you have some insight into a different direction you can go in the maze, or a misstep that somebody made. It could well be that, like, look, these guys had the right idea, they were just too early, or they didn't execute correctly, or they didn't have distribution, or they didn't do this thing right. That's okay if that's the answer, but you'd better have thought it through and actually have some good understanding of why that is the answer, as opposed to just kind of blindly throwing yourself into the maze and trying different things and hoping something works. So within blockchain in particular, I think this is a common problem I see with a lot of founders, that they don't really study the idea maze. They don't study the things that have happened before them. And without that, you're almost certainly doomed to repeat other people's mistakes. So the other thing that I want to emphasize when we're thinking about startup ideas is that your first idea is usually not perfect. Okay, this is normal. It's okay to pivot. Pivoting is when you basically start with an idea and you change to a different idea. This happens all the time. It is the most normal thing in the world. You should be prepared that your startup may have to pivot. Even if you commit to an idea, you may try it out, play around for a while, and realize that, hey, this isn't working. I gotta switch to a different market. Okay, so pivoting is normal in a startup, and you want to keep in mind the possibility that you may have to pivot down the road if the market that you're tackling doesn't work out or doesn't end up making sense. So if you keep in mind that there's always a possibility that you may have to pivot, this should give you a strong bias toward making reversible decisions. Okay, and by reversible decisions, I mean things that you can take back. So, for example, you're starting a crypto product. Okay, if you launch a token, your crypto product, it's very hard to take that back, right? Because now your token is owned by retail investors. All these people own your token, they traded your token went up, token went down. When you launch a token, it's very hard to take it back. So this should give you some trepidation about launching your token until you're absolutely confident, yes, this is exactly the idea that I want to settle on. If you're just experimenting, you probably should not launch a token because it's very hard to take that back. So anything that's not reversible, to be very careful at doing, because of the fact that you should keep in mind that you may need to pivot. Now, of course, it's also, there's also just iterating, right? Like as you start with an idea, you kind of iterate and get more clarity on what your idea should be or what your go-to-market should be. So sometimes the first idea will give you insight into the right way to solve a problem. So you should ideate quickly, build quickly, and disprove your assumptions quickly. So don't get too married to an idea. Don't kind of sit in it and just kind of fixate on it over and over and over again and try to hide it from people or whatever. This is a terrible way to try to validate an idea or try to get some clarity on whether or not this idea is good. You should just keep iterating, keep ideating, keep coming up with tons of ideas. The best way to have a great idea is to just have a lot of ideas and pick the best one. That's the most likely way you're going to end up with a great idea. But I also want to note that pivoting, it's very normal. And the first idea when you're building a startup is very often wrong. And in fact, there are a lot of startups in crypto that actually started doing something totally different than what they ended up doing. So just to give you a few examples, one of the most famous of which, or maybe infamous of which, is Mt. Gox. Mt. Gox was one of the very first Bitcoin exchanges and one of the most dominant ones. Originally, it was a platform for trading Magic the Gathering cards. And they ended up finding their way into being like, wait, actually, this crypto thing is pretty cool. We'll do this instead. Coinbase. Before it was an exchange, it was actually a hosted Bitcoin wallet. That was the original product for Coinbase, is that you could, host Bitcoin and transfer Bitcoin all on this like web app. That was Coinbase. There was no fiat on ramp. There was no, buying Bitcoin for dollars or buying Ether or buying anything else. It was just a hosted Bitcoin wallet. And they ended up pivoting into becoming this kind of broader platform for, financial services for crypto. Circle, which today is the issuer of USDC, which is the largest stablecoin. Originally, they were a peer-to-peer payments product. They were like a little app, kind of like, Cash App, that allowed you to pay people with both fiat money and with crypto. And they ended up eventually launching USDC, which became, now they don't do that anymore. They have a totally different line of business. OpenSea, the NFT platform, originally they were Wi-Fi coin. And the original idea that they actually got into Y Combinator with, which is a startup accelerator, was Wi-Fi coin, which is the idea that you can borrow, you can pay for Wi-Fi and use somebody else's Wi-Fi by paying them in Wi-Fi coin. So it was kind of you sort of get the thrust of the idea, but they realized after NFTs took off that NFTs were a lot more interesting, and they pivoted from Wi-Fi coin to become OpenSea. Polygon, which is a layer 1 blockchain. Originally, they were a Plasma implementation. I mean, I don't know, Plasma doesn't matter. We don't need to talk about it, but they ended up later becoming this kind of broader layer 1 in the broader ecosystem. But originally, they were trying to build Plasma. Near Protocol was originally an AI startup. They're now a layer 1. DOIDX, which is a on-chain lending protocol, or sorry, not lending, on-chain derivatives protocol. They were originally a Web3 search engine. So all these are fantastic companies in the world of crypto, all of which started with a different idea than the idea that they ended up becoming very successful for. So this is very common, and it's a thing that you should not be afraid of when you're thinking about your startup journey. Okay, so I want to go through some common ideation mistakes. We're almost at the end of the presentation, so I promise I'll breeze through the rest of this so we have some time for questions. So what are some common mistakes that I often see from founders who are ideating? One very common mistake is building for customers who don't exist yet. Okay, what do I mean? Very often people say, like, well, crypto people today, they're kind of insular. There's only certain types of people who are here. I don't want to build for them. I want to build for like Pinterest mommies, right? And I think they need a product in Web3 because, they don't really have any on-ramps yet. They're not really into space by and large. And so I'm going to build a product for those people. Okay. This is a mistake. This is almost always a mistake because you cannot build for people who aren't here yet. If they are not here yet, that means they won't use your product. That means you won't get any feedback. That means you won't be able to iterate, which means that you're just going to live in this feedback vacuum. And startups die when they don't get feedback. Startups live off feedback. That is the lifeblood of a startup. And so the only way that you can actually iterate is by building for people who are already here, even if it's a small cohort, even if it's a small group of people who are here. You have to find those people. You have to build something for them that they will love, that you can iterate and end up making more progress on understanding the thing that you need to build or the product that the problem that you need to solve. So another ideation mistake is solving yesterday's problem rather than tomorrow's problem. Okay. Now, what I mean by that, you're in a cycle, right? In that cycle, one of the problems might have been like, man, there are so many bootlegged, Bored Ape NFT drops, right? That's such a big problem. I'm going to build a startup that solves the problem of bootlegged Bored Ape NFT drops, like bootlegged NFT drops. Okay. That's a very specific problem. And it was a problem that we had like a year ago when NFT drops were super common. Now they're less common. But the question is like when your startup actually launches, it might take you 6 months to a year to actually build your product and get to market. Okay, so that means that 6 months to a year from now, you're actually going to have this thing that solves this problem that you were thinking about 2 years ago. And probably, by next year, there's going to be all sorts of new problems. There's going to be different things that crypto needs to deal with. And so this problem that you're solving, it's like, I see this all the time. There are a lot of companies that, in 2020 were like, this is a better platform to launch your ICO. Because, in 2018, 2017, there were a lot of people doing ICOs. Well, nobody was doing an ICO in 2020. And so these were startups that were solving yesterday's problem rather than tomorrow's problem. So you want to be thinking about problems that or continue to be important in the future. Or that are just beginning to be problems now. A small cohort of people are experiencing them. You can build a great product for those small cohort of people, but you believe that that is going to grow over time and more people are going to face this problem as the space grows. So another thing that I think is a very common issue is blockchain for X, where X is advertising or oil or bananas or whatever. Okay, this is just a general concept. This is kind of, again, it's sort of one of these ill-posed ideas, but very often whenever somebody tells me I'm building blockchain for blah, like, okay, that's not a real problem. You're not solving a problem. You're not talking to a real customer. It's just like buzzword for, it's not even X for Y, right? Because it's not even very clearly articulating what is the problem that is being solved here. But generally speaking, if I get a pitch that is blockchain for X, usually I think, okay, you haven't actually solved anything. You're just throwing a blockchain on something. Another common mistake is building in an unfriendly regulatory jurisdiction. So you want to keep broadly abreast of what's going on in regulation. And so, somebody might be like, I want to build a casino on the blockchain on Ethereum. So, okay, well, that is super illegal, and it's going to be really hard for you to do that. So you might want to think very carefully about where you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, and that is a very important input into thinking about what is a good idea and what's not a good idea. And the last one, and I think is a very, very common mistake, is building for crypto influencers. This is a huge mistake. Okay. And it's a very common thing I see a lot of people make. So a lot of people, especially if they live on Twitter or on Discord or whatever, they go on Twitter and they say, hey, I read all these Bitcoin maximalists or all these Ethereum maximalists who say, why can't I, walk around with a beautifully sculpted Bitcoin node that fits perfectly and kind of it looks exactly like my phone, but it's actually a decoy for my phone. I want that. You say, wow, this guy is so famous. He has so many followers and he wants that. That's great. I'm going to build something because he said that's what he wants. Well, the thing to realize is that crypto influencers are very weird. They're very weird people, and they're not like most of the people who are in crypto. Okay, so you want to think about the audience of people who are in crypto as these concentric circles. Okay, crypto influencers are at the very center, and they're really weird. They're very ideological. They care a lot about these kind of philosophical battles. They're not stereotypical users. Okay, they're very different from the stereotypical user. So most, if you read crypto influencers, a lot of them will say Coinbase is terrible, Binance is terrible. How can you trust somebody else to custody your keys? Like, are you really crypto at all? Like, blah blah blah. You're still enslaved by the man because you're blah, blah, all this stuff, right? Of course, we all know that Coinbase and Binance are the largest applications in the world for crypto. The vast majority of people who use crypto use those platforms. But if you read crypto influencers, you would think, wow, that's terrible. I should never build anything that's custodial. Well, that's the wrong lesson. You're not learning the right lesson. So now outside of crypto influencers, you've got crypto native people. There's a lot more of these than there are crypto influencers, but these are like the kind of, smarty pants people who are pretty technical. They'll use advanced products. They'll share stats about things on Twitter. They're less ideological than the kind of pure crypto influencers, but they're still, there aren't a ton of them that are out there. Then you look at the crypto curious. Okay, these are people who will, by the way, I made this a long time ago, so these numbers are actually pretty small. These numbers are underestimates. I think that you probably add at least one more zero to these. There's crypto curious. These are people who they'll show up on, they might read something on TikTok, and TikTok might tell them, hey, you should go onto DeFi and install MetaMask and, borrow this thing and do some liquidity mining. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. I'll figure out how to do that. And they don't really totally know what they're doing, but if there's enough of a value proposition, they'll be willing to do it. They're not super technical and they don't have any dog in the fight. They're just willing to use cool products. And then you have retail speculators, and retail speculators, anything with instructions is too much for them, right? So they're like, just, can I buy it on Coinbase? Can I buy it on Binance? If not, I don't know. This is too complicated. So the vast majority of people in crypto are that. That is what the vast majority of users in crypto are like. Now, that being said, they're not necessarily the most important users. If you want to build something that only is used by the crypto curious or crypto natives, or even by crypto influencers, you're totally free to do that. And there are a lot of great businesses that have been built that way. But you want to keep in mind who are the users that I'm actually targeting, and don't be naive about the particular users that you're going to be targeting with your application. Okay, so you have an idea. You've done all this thinking, did the analysis, top down, bottoms up, looking at the different trade-offs, right? Looking at the different features of the idea. Okay, now you need to validate your idea. How do you know if the idea is actually good? The answer is not sit and think in a dark room for many hours by yourself. Okay, you need to go and get some real external feedback from the world. So the best way to do this, generally speaking, is talk to customers. So who will use your product? We talked earlier about, kind of defining your stereotypical user. So you've got, okay, so I know it's, 30 something in New York who's got, whatever, and went to this school and makes this much money and uses DeFi a lot. Okay, so go find people like that. Go talk to them. Get an understanding of what they do, what products they use in their life, how they feel about the problem, how are they addressing the problem, right? If this is a big issue for them, let's say it's, I'm doing accounting software for DeFi. Okay, well, how are you doing your accounting? Well, it's like, well, I have a Google sheet and I have this thing and I kind of jerry rig all this stuff together. Like, understand what are the other products that your customers use and where they fall short. If they are not using anything, then there's a good chance that this is not really a problem. Because if it really is a problem, they'll usually jerry rig something together, or they'll find some way to try to address it. But if they don't, maybe this is not really a problem. Maybe you can convince yourself it's a problem, but if your customers are not doing something, then there's a good chance that this is not a problem. Now, a lot of people have the instinct that they want to ask customers, would you use this if I built this? This is almost always useless. Why is this almost always useless, right? If you say, look, if I built you an application for tracking your cost basis for NFTs that you buy, would you use it? Almost always the answer will be yes. Because these people now know you, and they're answering a survey, right? If you're answering a survey, you're going to say the thing to be nice because you know that there's an entrepreneur and you don't want to hurt their feelings, right? You're like, yeah, go for it. I love the spirit, man. You should go out and get it. Go get yours. But that doesn't mean anything about whether they would actually use your product. So asking them, would you use this thing, is not meaningful. The only way to really know if somebody would use your product or not is to ask them to pay for it. If you tell them, look, will you pre-buy my product? And they say yes, then you had better believe that this is a real problem that they have and that they would pay for it. But short of that, usually if you ask somebody, would you use this product? You're basically just asking them to stroke your ego. They're not giving you any useful information. So that is not a place where you can actually validate a product just by asking a bunch of people, would you use this thing? Okay. Lastly, the kind of last step of validation is thinking about whether or not you're building the right thing and validating whether you're building the right thing. So if you can, I would encourage you to build a proof of concept. And once you build that proof of concept, show it off online, show it off on a hackathon, post about it on Twitter, write a blog post, get people excited about your work and show them what you're working on. Many of the greatest projects in crypto were built exactly this way. So Uniswap, 1inch, Incidap, they were all hacked together in hackathons. None of them initially had funding, or they had grants rather than venture funding. And they just proved that the thing worked. The version 1 of Uniswap was launched without any venture funding. Version 1 of 1inch, no venture funding. Version 1 of Incidap, no venture funding. They just built the thing and showed that it worked. And when they showed that it worked, it's like, okay, cool, this thing is a real thing. And then they eventually raised venture capital. So it's only really by talking to users and figuring out their pain points that, whether it's online or whether it's in person or whatever, that you are going to get a better understanding of, am I building the right thing? And the best way to know if you're building the right thing is to just show it off and to have people actually use it. And that should validate your core assumptions about the thing that you're building. Okay. Now you should be able to find your good idea. No excuses if somebody doesn't have a good idea at the end of this course, because I told you everything you need to know. I will stop there. Let's take questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions to get through. So Xiaoyuan, if you could get started, and then I do probably have a hard stop in like 7 minutes. So I sincerely apologize, but hopefully I try to address as much questions as I could in the course of the actual lecture.
Thanks. So we do have like a lot of questions in the channel, so maybe we can pick some of them and leave the rest of them to the Discord channel for further discussion.
Sure.
So I think so just like a previous question on how do you research whether something has been done before or not? Just as a general question.
I don't know that there's a simple answer to that. I think you just have to kind of go back and I mean, the easiest thing in my mind is like talk to people who would care about this product. If you know people who care about this product, then you should be able to figure out what other products have you seen in the past. Google it. I mean, this is kind of a dumb question, a dumb answer, but it's honestly the answer. Right? Has there ever been an NFT lending protocol? I don't know. Google it. Right? If there was, they probably have written something about it.
Thanks. And there's also like a question about like the value. Specifically, how would you think about value in something that is less tangible? For example, Web3 social network, or let's say like a note-taking app. And also there's like another relevant question, I believe, which is like, which category does, let's say, making money through ads belong to, such as how Facebook make money? Is this like a good idea to make money through advertisement, or what do you think?
Yes. So making money through advertising is generally speaking, it's not a great business model. So making money through advertising has a very low ARPU, average revenue per user. Generally, it's like between $2 and $10 for like but if you have a very high quality user base, it can be higher than that. But we remember that slide where I showed like the different business sizes, right? Whoops, here. If you're using advertising, that basically means that you're the fly. You're hunting flies, which means that you need an enormous amount of users in order to build a valuable business. Now, if you're a social network, that's how it works, right? You have an enormous number of users, and you can charge each of them a very small amount of money through basically making a free product. But that's okay. That is one way to build a business in crypto or in general, and I think that's fine. With respect to so the last thing I'd say about advertising is that there's also a very big differential in the value of different kinds of advertising. So this is very often not obvious to people. People think that like, oh, okay, well, if I have a lot of eyeballs, then I can throw some advertising on it and I can make some money. But the value of advertising is extremely dependent on the way in which users arrive at your property. Okay. So if you are Facebook, then this is basically just passive advertising, right? You're scrolling through Facebook and you just see like random crap. That's like, it's customized to you, but it's just random crap, right? At that point, you have no intention to actually buy anything. You're just reading Facebook. So therefore, it's kind of like TV advertising, right? When you watch something on TV and then an advertisement pops up, or I guess YouTube or TikTok, I guess is what you guys would be using. Some random advertising pops up. You're not there to buy something. You're there because you're wanting to watch something, right? And so it's just kind of an annoying distraction. Whereas when you're like Google has extremely high ARPU, much higher monetizations. Why Google is such an amazing business is because when you're Googling something, you're actually looking for that thing. You're actually trying to buy that thing. Anytime you want to buy something, you Google it, right? And so your intent to actually spend money is very high for Google. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of crypto monies that do advertising actually monetize fairly well if they have very high intent for people who come on the website. So if you have a website called, I don't know, checkcoinprices.com, like I guess CoinMarketCap is the equivalent, right? CoinMarketCap monetizes through ads. They actually make a lot of money through ads because people who show up on CoinMarketCap, they want to buy coins. So if you want to buy coins, I'll send you to an exchange. You buy coins, I get a kickback. Great, right? So this is why just something that a lot of people will look at. So if you have a website, it's like cryptojokes.com, and a bunch of people love your jokes and they're so funny. Well, but there's very low intent for people who go on that site. They're not there to buy anything. So the value of that impression is going to be very low relative to a different kind of site. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you think about advertising. The other question was, how do you think about something that's very hard to quantify the value of?
Yes.
Yeah. So generally speaking, the answer that I would give is that usually when you say that it's hard to quantify the value of something, it's actually not hard to quantify the value of it. It's just that it's not that valuable. So again, it's very easy to convince yourself like, wow, note taking is so important. It's like, part of my productivity and it's so essential. Usually the answer is that it's actually not that important. Note taking apps are nice to have, but like if you didn't have a note taking app, what would you do instead? Well, you'd like use Notepad. How much better is your note taking app than Notepad? Well, it's like quality of life improvement. It's a little bit more convenient, but it's like not that big of a deal. So generally speaking, unless there's some real magical special circumstance, if you're not willing to pay money for this, it's probably not that valuable. You can assume that the money you're willing to pay is a good proxy for how valuable something is. The other thing, of course, is that for a lot of things that are quote unquote not that valuable, the reason why they're not that valuable is that there's pure unbridled competition, right? So something like Evernote, well, there's so many things that offer note-taking apps. They're so easy to build. A lot of people have them. And so if you're going to create a note-taking app, you have to charge commodity pricing. You have to charge only as much as it costs you to render that service, which is very cheap. So that's why it may be very valuable, right? To have, I don't know, to have reading glasses, right? That's one of the most valuable things you can possibly imagine. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to charge a lot of money selling reading glasses. One more question, and then we got to wrap.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So we also have a question about like proof of concept. So how fully featured should a proof of concept be? And also there's a relevant question asking how do you balance executing and building something for a proof of concept and knowing not to build too much to complete the product? So
so if you're building a proof of concept, the first thing that I would try to do, so the point of a proof of concept is to validate your idea. Now, what does that mean to validate your idea? It depends on the idea. Right. So generally speaking, it's like to prove value. When I say validate idea, I mean prove value. You prove value by getting somebody to pay money for your thing. If nobody's willing to pay money for your thing, then you haven't proven it's valuable. So whatever it takes for you to get there, I think is relevant for a proof of concept. Now, if you're building like a protocol or some kind of technology, then the proof of concept is showing that this thing can actually work. So, I claim that I have the consensus mechanism that can validate transactions extremely fast. Okay, well, you need to build a proof of concept that can show, can you actually do the thing that validates super fast, or is that only true on paper, right? In practice, does it actually do that? So generally speaking, you want to prove the underlying claim, but it's on you. I can't answer it for you. You have to think about what's the underlying claim that I actually need to validate, and what is kind of the minimum viable way to validate that. So anything that doesn't help you validate that, don't put it in the MVP. Or don't put it in the, not the MVP, don't put it in the proof of concept. So an MVP and a proof of concept are two different things. MVP stands for minimal viable product. We'll talk about that more when we talk about in the product lecture, but a minimal viable product is like the smallest possible thing you can ship that people will actually pay for. That is like the finished product, even if it's not totally polished, even if it's not like ideal, but it does the thing that it says on the tin. Whereas a proof of concept proves that this thing is possible, proves that you can do it, and proves that the idea that you have, you can actually show it to a customer and actually get real feedback, as opposed to just, hey, what if I blah blah blah? It's like, yeah, sure, I would do it. Well, look at it. This is it. Would you use this? Like, well, actually, never mind. Now that I see it, I realize I wouldn't use this. So that's why it's so important to build a proof of concept if and when you can. Okay, that is it. Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to be back next week for DAOs and other decentralized applications with Balaji. So yeah, we can continue the conversation on Discord, but appreciate your patience. And I'm gonna go run off in Singapore, but I'm very tired. So Appreciate all of your patience.
Thank you.
Take care. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.